Hi everyone, so a few days ago I attended Ved Talks where I gave a speech, and for those of you who don't know, Ved Talks, it's basically the same thing as TED Talks, it's the same idea. The only difference is with Ved Talks, the speakers are talking about issues directly related to veganism and vegan activism, and I gave a speech about how I believe intersectional activists are harming the vegan movement and vegan activism, and I actually mentioned a particular intersectional activist who is causing issues in the vegan community, and that would be Darren Chang. Some of you may remember Darren Chang as the guy who got me banned from speaking at the Toronto Vegetarian Association event this past summer because he spread a number of lies about me. Now, not too many people know about Darren Chang, so I thought it was important that if I were to share the speech online on my YouTube channel that I provide some added context during my speech because, again, not too many people know about Darren Chang. So what you're about to see is the speech I gave at the Ved Talks event, and whenever I mention Darren Chang, I'm just going to stop the video and give a little bit more explanation just for people who don't know much about Darren Chang and need some added context. So, I have a question for all of you. When you take your dog to a park, and, just to get it some exercise, get your dog some fun, do any of you get triggered when someone assumes your dog's gender? And I'm sure some of you are fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. When someone tells you they didn't really like the Black Panther movies, do you accuse them of being racist? And last question, do any of you avoid eating nuts? Not because you're allergic, but because you don't want to culturally appropriate squirrels? So obviously I'm being, a bit facetious here, I'm joking, exaggerating a bit, but you might have heard some similar things from intersectional activists. And besides being a little crazy and annoying, I'd say intersectionality is the biggest issue facing veganism, and I'd argue it's actually a bigger issue than things like ag-gag laws and just asshole cops. So, first of all, what is intersectionality? Well, intersectionality is a concept that was created by a feminist scholar named Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. She had the idea that different forms of discrimination can combine to create even more harm against marginalized groups of people. This idea of intersectionality, as Kimberly Williams Crenshaw imagined it, focused on black women, but it's been applied to all sorts of different groups. So, for example, a black woman might experience both sexism and racism, and when trying to help marginalized groups of people like this, you do have to identify these different forms of discrimination and oppression in order to achieve equality. Now, I don't have any problem with this idea of intersectionality as it's defined in academia. I think this concept is perfectly sound, and I can say from my own personal experience, I've probably been discriminated against because of my skin color, because of my gender, and I've known other people who are discriminated based on a number of different things, disabilities, the color of their skin, gender, sexuality. So I don't have any issue with how intersectionality is defined in academia, but how these intersectional activists describe it is a bit different. So intersectional activists have changed the idea to mean all forms of oppression intersect and are actually related to one another. And this creates a whole host of problems, especially when these intersectionalists get involved in vegan activism. So first of all, because intersectional activists believe all forms of oppression are related to one another, they're going to eventually get involved in vegan activism because they think somehow animal rights is related to other forms of oppression like sexism, racism, income inequality, and what have you. So let me ask you, what does something like the wage gap between men and women have to do with animals being tortured, murdered, and having their flesh and byproducts be sold on a free market? Absolutely nothing. The reality is veganism and animal rights, it's its own separate issue, and it is in no way related to any other social justice issue. So right there, combining intersectional activism with veganism creates a problem because you're no longer campaigning for animal rights, you're campaigning for every single social justice issue under the sun, and animal rights takes a back seat. Now, that's not to say other social justice issues aren't important, because, we all have to prioritize, and if we're going to be involved in the animal rights community, if our priorities are animal rights, Why are we getting intersectionality involved in animal rights when that is only going to harm, stifle, and water down the animal rights message? So a huge issue with these intersectional activists getting involved in vegan activism is that they're not actually interested in vegan activism, and they just end up prioritizing other social justice issues that they're actually interested in. And a great example of this is, again, Darren Chang. Darren has actually made a post on Facebook where he claimed he really only cares about fighting for collective liberation, and that only just so happens to include animal liberation. So right there, Darren Chang, who, considers himself an intersectional activist, is admitting that, vegan activism isn't really his priority. He's fighting for what he calls collective liberation, not animal liberation. And not only does Darren Chang not prioritize vegan activism, but he also discourages vegan activism. Because I criticized a woman for consuming dairy products, Darren tried to shame me, claiming I should never have tried to explain to this woman why it is wrong to consume dairy or any other animal products, because he claims it hurt her intersectional activism. So right there, again, Darren is claiming that he cares more about intersectional activism than vegan activism, and it's gotten to the point where he actually criticizes vegans, shaming them for criticizing intersectional activists, even though they are supporting the animal products industry. So I think my point is totally valid in the speech that intersectional activists don't really care about vegan activism, and they are directly harming, or at least trying to harm vegan activism. And I'm sure many of you who are involved in the animal rights scene have noticed that some of these intersectional activists have created a bit of a culture clash, a bit of friction. So one of the strategies of intersectionalists, of course, is to get as many people involved in their group as possible. So if you're in an animal rights group, intersectionalists among you, they'll bring up the topic of intersectionality. They'll start talking about things like feminism, gender, racial equality. And again, we're campaigning for animal rights. That's not necessarily appropriate. It might rub people the wrong way. But intersectionalists create an even bigger problem when people will eventually disagree with them. Now, vegans are a very diverse group of people, and that's only increasingly becoming true. I'm seeing a lot more men become vegan activists, which is a great thing. I'm also seeing a lot more people of color. And I'm also, seeing people coming into vegan activism from all sorts of political backgrounds. So not everyone is going to agree with intersectionality. Just because we're seeing a diverse range of people getting involved in animal rights, people of different genders, different political backgrounds, different countries. So not everyone's going to agree with this sort of political ideology. Well, if you disagree with an intersectionalist, you're in pretty big trouble, and I'm sure some of us here might have had that experience. As I mentioned, these intersectional activists have distorted the meaning of intersectionality to mean different forms of oppression are all related to each other. So if you don't agree with even one of their political beliefs, well, now you've quite literally become Hitler to them. If you don't agree with feminism, that means by extension you are supporting racism and all other forms of bigotry because they're all interrelated to one another. And I've experienced this myself because I don't support Black Lives Matter, because I've criticized the wage gap myth between men and women. Intersectional activists have called me far right-wing, racist, white supremacist, homophobic, women hater, just because I happen to have a few minor political disagreements. And of course, a great example of this behavior is Darren Chang. He has posted all over Facebook about how I'm a terrible person, I'm a racist, misogynist, homophobe, all of these terrible things. He's also sent these complaints to the Toronto Vegetarian Association, and one of their organizers just parroted these ridiculous lies that Darren made up about me. And when I asked Darren to provide proof for these claims about me, he refuses. He also won't engage in any kind of debate or discussion with me, because he knows he's lying, and, obviously he's going to avoid providing proof, he's going to avoid discussing any of this with me, because he'll just be caught in a lie. So people like Darren Chang, these intersectional activists, if they have any kind of problem with you, any kind of minor disagreement, they will accuse you of being the worst person on earth, because that's just one of their tactics. They're terrible people, and they just lie about everyone they disagree with. And the funny thing with this sort of behavior among intersectional activists is it's completely counterintuitive to their supposed goal of diversity. when they are completely intolerant towards anyone who disagrees with them, that's going to severely limit who they allow into the group. I think one of the goals for vegan activism is to try to get as many people involved in animal rights as possible. Well, if you demand that animal rights activists also commit to being intersectional activists who also campaign for things like animal rights, gay and trans rights, that's going to severely limit the amount of people who are going to be interested in animal rights. We already have huge issues getting men and politically right-leaning people involved in animal rights. How many men, especially conservative men, are going to be interested in animal rights when they're also expected to support feminism and trans rights activism? So veganism and animal rights should appeal to everyone, no matter your gender, race, age, political background. But intersectional activists are making it so veganism only appeals to white women who are still in college. And it doesn't end there. One of the most disgusting things I've seen among intersectional activists is their promotion of misandry and anti-white racism. A belief that you'll commonly see among intersectional activists is that oppression has a root cause, and many of them believe the root cause of oppression is white males. So intersectionalists will be especially hostile to white males. I know someone who is a great example of this, Darren Chang, and Darren Chang is sitting right there. He's the little Asian dude. He's holding his hand up right there. So Darren Chang is somewhat infamous among the animal rights community. Some of you may be familiar with him, especially if you've been involved with Fur Canada Goose protests. Darren Chang is a racist. On many occasions, he's complained about there being too many white people around these activist events. He's done everything he can to make white men feel unwelcome when they try to participate in vegan activism. I've received a lot of emails and messages on Facebook from people complaining about Darren, feeling uncomfortable around him because of his blatant racism and terrible behavior towards white males. So Darren Chang is in fact a racist, and he particularly hates white men, and I'll provide some proof for you. So Exhibit A, you will commonly find Darren Chang making posts like this on Facebook, where he'll share ridiculous articles like these. America is infested with domestic white male terrorists, and you'll notice that some of the men in these photos are actually school shooters. So Darren is suggesting that we have to fear white men. White men are particularly violent. They're a huge terrorist threat. And by the way, this is an intersectionalist. If you were to share something similar about Muslim immigrants, an article saying that Muslim immigrants are a terrorist threat, Darren Chang would be very quick to call you a racist and Islamophobe, but Darren is totally fine with sharing things like this because he's the one who's actually racist. He hates white men, and he'll share ridiculous articles like these to try and spread this fear and hate of white males. And I think any sensible person knows that white men aren't actually a terrorist threat. They're not the most likely demographic to commit terror, especially acts of terror that result in death. And you'll also often find Darren Chang shaming and belittling people just because they're white, just because he doesn't like the color of their skin. So here's Darren Chang getting into an argument with Isaac, also known as Ask Yourself. So Darren Chang told Isaac, "You offer nothing original to the movement. The only reason why you even remotely have a platform for doing Philosophy 101 on YouTube is because society likes to coddle little white boys." Right, so here's Darren claiming that the only reason anyone will listen to you is because you're white. Yeah, that's not racist at all, right, Darren? Here's another argument that Darren Chang got into with Patrick, who is a friend of mine, who is another vegan activist. Darren said, "You don't have to believe me, lol. All right, that's enough white nonsense for the day." So, according to Darren, white people just talk complete nonsense. Now, imagine if Darren said that exact same thing, but to a black person like me. That's enough black nonsense for today. You N-words just can't make any sense. So Darren is a complete racist. He hates white males, and this sort of behavior is disgusting. And I've also been sent a lot of messages through email, through Facebook about this sort of behavior. So here's a message I received from someone talking about their experiences with Darren, and I'm going to leave their name and photo obscured because I think they want to stay anonymous, but I will say this person is a white male, and they claim to have had terrible problems with Darren in Vancouver where they were doing activism at the time. And this person also describes Darren as abusive.
So this isn't just an isolated incident. I'm not just cherry picking, one bad quote from Darren. This is a very clear pattern of behavior that shows Darren is a racist, and he especially hates white men. He tries to spread hate and fear towards white males on Facebook. Also on Facebook and other forms of social media, he constantly belittles and shames people for being white, especially if they're white men. And people who've dealt with him in these activist circles describe him as abusive, creating all of these problems in these animal rights groups. So Darren is clearly a racist, and for him to accuse people like me of racism, it is absolutely ridiculous. Darren is the one who's the problem here. He is the one who's racist.
I've also seen many intersectional activists complain that some of the leading figures in the animal rights movement, like Earthling Ed, are white males, and they're not even shy about admitting this. They blatantly want to shun and silence some of the best vegan activists in their movement just because they're white, just because they're male. And I think this just proves how little they actually care. If they believed white males are the ones who have the most power and influence in society, wouldn't that make you even more interested in targeting white males to join your cause, to try to get them to become vegan activists, if they have all the power and influence in society? Wouldn't it make the most amount of sense to try to get as many white males into, veganism and vegan activism as possible, since they have the most amount of potential to do good, to make positive change for the animals? So their refusal to be inclusive just shows you they really don't care about the animals, and they don't even care about the moral principles they espouse. Again, these people claim they want to support minorities and marginalized groups of people. Well, then why are they attacking me when I'm black? Darren Chang, one of these intersectional activists, claims they want to see more minority voices in veganism, yet they're spreading horrible lies about me in an attempt to get me deplatformed and ostracized from vegan activist groups. And this brings me to my final issue with many of these intersectionalists. They don't care about animal rights, they don't care about feminism, they don't care about racism, and they don't care about any of these social justice issues. They're just trying to use social justice to control and manipulate people because they're megalomaniacal, narcissistic sociopaths. Intersectional activism is a very easy tool to control political opinion and social discourse, and that sort of thing is going to attract megalomaniacal, manipulative sociopaths who can't handle any amount of criticism and who want to control and manipulate people. Notice how it's a common theme among intersectional activists that they won't negotiate, they won't compromise, and if you disagree with them, they'll slander you, they'll try to deplatform you, and do whatever they can to shut you up. So for all of these reasons mentioned, intersectionality or intersectional activism has no place in veganism. Not only does it not make any practical sense, not only does it hinder vegan activism, but intersectional activism is extremely exclusive. It shuns people of different racial and political backgrounds, and it attracts the most disgusting, manipulative, and nasty people that we don't want polluting our animal rights movement. Thank you.
So I hope you all enjoyed my speech, and if any of you do vegan activism, especially vegan activism around Toronto, and you deal with Darren Chang, please share this video with your activist friends, share this video in activist Facebook groups. Not only do I think this is an important message, but it's also important to expose Darren Chang. This sort of, horrible, toxic, racist behavior shouldn't be tolerated anywhere, but especially not in vegan activism, and people like Darren Chang, they need to be outed as, the horrible racists they are. So I hope this, message reaches far and wide and has a positive influence on these vegan activist groups, including those in Toronto that somehow allow this horrible racist Darren Chang to run amok and just cause problems. And with that said, as always, keep making those vegan and vegan activism gains.
What a relief! When will this poisonous product cease? This is another public service announcement. You can believe it or you can doubt it. Let us begin now with the cow. The way it gets to your plate and how.